In 1920, the United States government did something no modern democracy had ever attempted at scale. It banned an entire industry overnight. Factories were shuttered, breweries were converted, saloons were padlocked, and agents of the newly created Prohibition Bureau fanned out across the country with orders to enforce the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, a law that made the production, sale, and transportation of alcohol a federal crime. It lasted 13 years. And in that time, it did not stop people from drinking. It made them drink more creatively. Speakeasies, illegal bars hidden behind bakeries, barbershops and furniture stores, numbered in the tens of thousands in New York City alone. Organized crime exploded. Al Capone's bootlegging operation reportedly generated the equivalent of over $1 billion a year in today's money. The government, desperate to deter consumption, began poisoning the industrial alcohol that bootleggers were redistilling for sale. Historians estimate that between 10,000 and 50,000 Americans died from government-poisoned liquor during Prohibition. The ban failed completely, and in 1933 it was repealed. That story says something important about alcohol. Not just that people like it, but that it is woven into human civilization so deeply that governments cannot simply decide to remove it. Every empire that tried to suppress it learned the same lesson. Every culture that tried to eliminate it produced the same result. You cannot separate alcohol from human history, because in a very real sense, alcohol may have helped create human history. But the story of alcohol does not start in a Chicago speakeasy. It does not start in a French vineyard, or a German brewery, or a Scottish distillery. It starts in the wild, thousands of years before anyone knew what fermentation was. The oldest alcohol humans ever consumed was not made by humans. Fruit ferments naturally when wild yeast in the air makes contact with sugar in the pulp. Overripe figs, fallen berries, rotting plums, left long enough in warm conditions, they begin to bubble and transform. Animals have known this for millennia. Elephants in Africa have been observed deliberately seeking out and eating fermented marula fruit. Birds in North America have been documented crashing into windows after gorging on fermented berries. Malaysian tree shrews lap up fermented nectar from Bertam palms every single night and show no signs of intoxication. Their livers, researchers discovered, metabolize alcohol at a rate that would be superhuman by human standards. Our primate ancestors were almost certainly doing the same thing. In 2015, a team of molecular biologists published research showing that approximately 10 million years ago, a genetic mutation occurred in the common ancestor of gorillas, chimpanzees, and early hominins. That mutation dramatically upgraded the ADH4 enzyme, the enzyme responsible for metabolizing ethanol. Before that mutation, our ancestors could barely process alcohol at all. After it, they could consume and digest fermented fruit with relative efficiency. The timing matters. 10 million years ago coincides roughly with a major climate shift in East Africa. Forests were shrinking. Fruit that once fell and rotted on the ground, untouched and uneaten, was suddenly a viable food source. The primates that could eat it without becoming dangerously intoxicated had a survival advantage. The ones that could not, did not pass on their genes as effectively. We did not start drinking because we enjoyed it. We started drinking because evolution rewarded those who could handle what the forest was offering. The earliest firm archaeological evidence of intentional alcohol production is approximately 9,000 years old. In 2004, researchers analyzing ceramic jars recovered from a Neolithic village in the Henan province of China discovered chemical residue that could only have come from a deliberately fermented mixture of rice, honey, hawthorn fruit, and wild grapes. The jars dated to around 7000 BC. They were not storage vessels, they were brewing vessels. The village of Jehal was producing something very close to what we would recognize as a mixed fermented beverage, not quite wine, not quite beer, something in between, almost 10,000 years ago. Around the same time, on the other side of the world, people in what is now Georgia and Armenia were doing something similar with wild grapes. The oldest evidence of grape wine production comes from a site called Gadakrili Gora in the South Caucasus, dated to around 6000 BC. Archaeologists found grape seeds, pressed grape skins, and the unmistakable chemical signature of tartaric acid inside large clay storage jars. Someone had figured out that crushed grapes, left to sit, became something extraordinary. But the civilization that truly industrialized alcohol, that turned it from a curiosity into a cornerstone of daily life, was ancient Mesopotamia. The Sumerians, who built the world's first cities in the flat river valleys between the Tigris and Euphrates around 3500 BC, were devoted brewers. Their word for beer, kash, appears in some of the oldest written texts ever found. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the first works of literature in human history, includes a scene in which the wild man Enkidu is civilized, in part by being given bread and beer. He drinks 7 cups, his heart grows light, his face glows, he washes himself and becomes human. Beer was not recreation in Sumer, it was nutrition. A standard daily ration for a laborer included approximately 1 liter of beer per day. Rations for scribes and skilled workers were higher. Beer provided calories, some B vitamins, and crucially, it was safer to drink than water. In a world without germ theory, where standing water could harbour cholera, dysentery and typhoid, the mild acidity and alcohol content of beer killed pathogens that water did not. Drinking beer kept people alive. The Sumerians had a goddess of beer. Her name was Ninkasi, which translates roughly as the lady who fills the mouth. A hymn to Ninkasi, dated to around 1800 BC, is also the oldest known recipe for beer in history. Read literally, it describes the process of making bread from grain, soaking that bread in water, filtering the liquid, and allowing it to ferment, barley in, beer out. The hymn was almost certainly used to help brewers memorize the process, before writing was widespread enough to preserve technical instructions. The Egyptians were equally devoted. Workers who built the pyramids at Giza were paid partly in beer, roughly 4 to 5 litres per day per worker. This was not because the pharaohs were generous, it was because beer was a form of currency with nutritional value, and keeping tens of thousands of labourers adequately fed and watered was a logistical challenge that beer helped solve. Egyptian medical texts from the same period list beer as an ingredient in over 100 remedies. It was used to treat wounds, digestive problems and respiratory illness. When a child was sick, a physician might prescribe beer mixed with herbs. Alcohol was medicine. Alcohol was food. Alcohol was money. Alcohol was religion. Every major ancient civilization treated alcohol as a bridge between the human and the divine. In Greece, wine was the drink of Dionysus, the god of ecstasy, madness, and fertility. His festivals, the Dionysia, were occasions for theatrical performance, communal drinking, and the temporary dissolution of social boundaries. Masters and slaves drank together. The citizen and the foreigner raised the same cup. Scholars now believe that the psychological and social function of these festivals was partly intentional, a controlled release valve for the tensions inherent in a rigidly stratified society. Greek symposia, the private drinking parties of the educated elite, were highly ritualized affairs. Wine was always diluted with water, typically in a ratio of 2 or 3 parts water to 1 part wine. Drinking undiluted wine was considered barbaric, the kind of thing that Scythians and Persians did. A proper symposium involved drinking in moderation, which allowed for the kind of extended philosophical conversation that Plato later recorded. The dialogues of Socrates frequently take place at or around a symposium. Western philosophy, in a very real sense, unfolded around wine. In ancient India, a ritual drink called soma appears throughout the Rig Veda, one of the oldest religious texts in the world, composed around 1500 BC. Scholars have debated for 2 centuries what soma actually was. Some believe it was a drink made from the ephedra plant. Others argue for a hallucinogenic mushroom. Others still suggest it was simply a strong fermented drink made from grain or fruit. Whatever it was, the Rig Veda describes it as the drink of the gods, the source of immortality, and the force that allowed the god Indra to slay the cosmic serpent Vritra and bring order to the universe. In Mesoamerica, the Aztecs had pulque, a fermented drink made from the sap of the agave plant, the same plant that today gives us tequila and mezcal. Pulque was closely associated with a pantheon of 400 rabbit gods collectively called the Sentzon Totochi, who presided over drunkenness and intoxication. Ordinary Aztecs were generally only permitted to drink pulque at specific religious festivals. The elderly were allowed to drink more freely. Public drunkenness outside of permitted occasions could be punished severely, sometimes by death. The pattern repeats across cultures that had no contact with each other. Fermented drinks were sacred, they were controlled, they were reserved for ritual. The experience of intoxication was understood, instinctively, as an encounter with something beyond ordinary human consciousness. In the 7th century AD, the Prophet Muhammad received a revelation that would reshape the relationship between a significant portion of the world and alcohol. The Quran does not condemn alcohol in a single sweeping verse. The prohibition developed gradually, across multiple passages revealed over several years. First, believers were told that wine contains both benefit and sin, and that the sin outweighs the benefit. Then they were told not to approach prayer while intoxicated. Finally, they were told that wine and gambling were abominations devised by Satan and must be avoided entirely. For the expanding Islamic civilization of the 7th and 8th centuries, this was transformative. But here is the paradox that shapes the entire modern world. The culture that theologically prohibited alcohol was simultaneously the culture most responsible for the technology that makes modern alcohol possible. Arab chemists, working in a tradition that prized experimental inquiry and the distillation of medicinal compounds, perfected the alembic still, the device used to distill liquids by heating them and capturing the vapors. The word alcohol itself comes from the Arabic al-kuhul, which originally referred to finely ground antimony powder used as eye makeup, and was later extended to mean any substance obtained through distillation or sublimation. Al-Kindi, a 9th century Arab polymath, wrote detailed instructions for distilling wine into what he called water of life, a concentrated spirit, not for drinking but for use in perfume and medicine. Al-Razi, another Arab chemist of the same era, systematized distillation processes that European alchemists would later inherit and adapt. The knowledge passed into Europe through the libraries of Moorish Spain and through contact with Islamic scholars during the Crusades. By the 12th century, monks in Italian monasteries were distilling wine into spirits using Arabic techniques and calling the result aqua vitae, water of life. The same phrase appears, independently, in Gaelic as wish better, which eventually became whiskey. Distillation changed everything. Wine and beer could only reach a certain alcohol concentration before the yeast died and fermentation stopped. Distillation could concentrate alcohol far beyond what fermentation alone could produce. Suddenly, spirits were possible. Brandy, gin, rum, whiskey, vodka. The entire category of hard liquor came from a process developed in the Islamic world, passed through medieval Europe, and eventually spread around the globe. In the 16th century, European colonial expansion created a global trade network built in large part on three commodities: sugar, slaves, and alcohol. The triangle trade, as historians call it, worked roughly as follows. European ships carried manufactured goods to the west coast of Africa. There, those goods were exchanged for enslaved people, who were transported across the Atlantic to plantations in the Caribbean and the American colonies. The plantations produced sugar, and the molasses left over from sugar refining, which was shipped back to Europe and New England to be made into rum, which was then sold or traded for more manufactured goods. Rum was central to this system. It was produced cheaply from sugar byproducts. It kept well on long sea voyages, and it was wildly profitable. By the early 18th century, New England had over 100 distilleries producing rum from Caribbean molasses. Boston and Newport became some of the wealthiest cities in North America, largely on the basis of the rum trade. The British Royal Navy issued every sailor a daily ration of rum, a practice that began in the Caribbean in the 1650s and continued, remarkably, until 1970. The daily tot of rum was considered essential for morale, for preventing scurvy when mixed with citrus, which it sometimes was, and for making the brutal conditions of naval life survivable. When the Navy finally abolished the rum ration on July 31st, 1970, a day sailors called Black Tot Day, men wept on deck. In the American colonies, rum was not merely a drink, it was a currency, a trade good, and a political tool. Historians have estimated that on the eve of the American Revolution, the average American colonist consumed approximately 34 liters of alcohol per year, roughly 3 times the modern American average. This was not purely recreational. Beer and cider were safer than water in many colonial settlements. Alcohol was part of the caloric intake. Laborers expected it as part of their wages. Doctors prescribed it for nearly every ailment. When the newly formed American government attempted to tax whiskey in 1791, frontier farmers in western Pennsylvania rose up in armed rebellion. The Whiskey Rebellion of 1794 was one of the first major tests of federal authority under the new Constitution. George Washington personally led troops to suppress it, the only time in American history a sitting president commanded forces in the field. The tax was eventually repealed. The message was clear: tax anything, just not the whiskey. While rum dominated the Atlantic world, a different alcohol crisis was unfolding in Britain. In the early 18th century, the British government, seeking to reduce dependence on French wine and brandy and to support domestic grain farmers, made it legal for anyone to distill spirits from grain without a license. The result was an explosion of cheap gin production that consumed London from the bottom up. Between 1720 and 1751, gin production in England increased by roughly 7-fold. In some London neighbourhoods, 1 in every 4 houses was estimated to be selling gin. The drink was so cheap that a single penny could render a man insensible. A sign outside one notorious gin shop reportedly read, "Drunk for a penny, dead drunk for 2 pence, clean straw for nothing." The gin craze destroyed families. Infant mortality in London during this period spiked dramatically. Mothers dosed children with gin to keep them quiet. Workers drank on the job. Crime rates rose. William Hogarth's famous pair of prints, Gin Lane and Beer Street, published in 1751, depicted gin as a force of social disintegration, so complete that mothers dropped babies into open graves while reaching for the bottle. The government eventually intervened with the Gin Acts of 1736 and 1751, imposing heavy taxes and licensing requirements that drove up the price and regulated production. The crisis slowly abated, but it left a permanent mark on British attitudes toward alcohol and planted the seeds of the temperance movement that would eventually cross the Atlantic and produce American Prohibition more than a century later. For most of human history, no one actually knew why fermentation worked. Bread rose, wine transformed, beer bubbled and developed intoxicating properties. Vinegar formed when wine was exposed to air too long. All of this happened reliably, repeatedly, across thousands of years of human practice, and no one had any idea what was actually causing it. The explanation came from Louis Pasteur. In 1857, Pasteur published a landmark paper demonstrating that fermentation was not a purely chemical process, it was a biological one. Living microorganisms, specifically yeast, were consuming sugar and producing alcohol and carbon dioxide as byproducts. This was not spontaneous transformation, it was life eating sugar and exhaling ethanol. The implications were immediate and enormous. If fermentation was a biological process driven by specific organisms, then it could be controlled. You could select strains of yeast for desirable qualities. You could kill unwanted microorganisms with heat, a process Pasteur developed and that now bears his name, pasteurization. You could prevent wine from turning to vinegar by understanding what conditions allowed the wrong organisms to take over. The brewing and wine industries were transformed almost overnight. Scientific understanding replaced folk knowledge. Consistent, replicable fermentation became possible at industrial scale. The era of mass-produced, standardized alcohol had arrived. By the late 19th century, large-scale industrial breweries were emerging across Europe and America. Refrigeration technology, developed in the 1870s and 1880s, allowed lager beers, which required cold fermentation, to be produced year-round rather than only in winter. Pilsner, a light, crisp, pale lager style developed in the Czech city of Plzeň in 1842, spread rapidly across Europe and then the world. Today, Pilsner-style lager accounts for the majority of all beer consumed on Earth. Advertising, branding, and distribution networks scaled the industry further. By the early 20th century, alcohol was not just a beverage, it was a global business worth billions. Which brings us back to 1920. The Prohibition movement in America was not born from nowhere. It grew from decades of temperance advocacy, rooted in genuine social concern. Alcohol-related domestic violence was a serious and largely unaddressed problem. Workers were drinking significant portions of their wages. Saloons in many cities were tightly connected to political machines and organized crime. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, founded in 1874, campaigned for decades to restrict or eliminate alcohol. Carrie Nation, one of the movement's most theatrical figures, physically smashed saloons with a hatchet in the early 1900s, arguing that she was doing the work of God. The Anti-Saloon League, founded in 1893, was one of the most effective single-issue lobbying organizations in American history. It systematically pressured politicians at every level of government and helped push through the 18th Amendment. The amendment passed. Prohibition began on January 17, 1920, and the unintended consequences began almost immediately. Prohibition did not eliminate alcohol. It eliminated legal alcohol. The bootlegging industry that replaced it was enormous, violent, and entirely unregulated. Al Capone, Bugsy Siegel, Lucky Luciano, the organized crime empires of the 1920s and 1930s were built primarily on liquor. The federal government, which had expected to save money by reducing alcohol-related crime and poverty, instead spent massively on enforcement and watched tax revenue from the liquor industry, which had been significant, disappear overnight. The corruption was staggering. Police officers were bribed. Judges were bought. Politicians looked the other way. In some cities, prohibition existed almost entirely on paper. When Franklin Roosevelt ran for president in 1932, he explicitly campaigned on repealing prohibition. He won in a landslide. The 21st Amendment was ratified in December 1933, and America went back to drinking legally. But prohibition left a permanent mark. The consolidation of the brewing and distilling industries after repeal meant that large corporations now dominated the market in ways they hadn't before. Craft brewing traditions that had existed before Prohibition did not fully recover for decades. The organized crime networks built during Prohibition simply pivoted to other enterprises rather than dissolving. And the fundamental lesson that banning alcohol does not make it disappear, it only changes who controls it, was learned, forgotten, and relearned repeatedly across the 20th century. Today, the global alcohol industry generates approximately $2 trillion in revenue annually. Beer is the world's most consumed alcoholic beverage by volume. Wine dominates by value in European markets. Spirits, whiskey, vodka, gin, rum, tequila have seen dramatic global growth in the early 21st century, particularly in Asia. Chinese baijiu, a grain spirit with a history stretching back over 1,000 years, is by volume the most consumed spirit on Earth. Most Westerners have never heard of it. The craft brewing revolution, which began quietly in the United States in the 1970s and 1980s, when home brewing was finally legalized in 1978 after being prohibited since Prohibition, exploded in the 2000s and 2010. By 2023, there were over 9,000 craft breweries operating in the United States alone, more than at any point in history, including before Prohibition. The wine industry has been reshaped by climate change, globalization, and shifting consumer tastes. Regions that were once too cold to grow wine grapes reliably, parts of England, Scandinavia, and Canada, are now producing award-winning bottles as temperatures rise. Traditional wine regions in France, Spain, and Italy face droughts and heat events that threaten the character of wines that have been consistent for centuries. Alcohol and health science have developed a complicated relationship. Early studies in the 1990s seem to suggest that moderate wine consumption reduced the risk of heart disease, the so-called French paradox. Those findings have been substantially revised. More recent and more rigorous research suggests that no level of alcohol consumption is entirely risk-free, and that whatever cardiovascular benefit researchers once attributed to wine was likely confounded by other lifestyle factors. At the same time, alcohol consumption per capita is declining in many high-income countries, particularly among younger generations. The so-called sober-curious movement has driven significant growth in non-alcoholic beverages, sophisticated, craft-produced drinks designed to replicate the ritual of a cocktail without the ethanol. Athletic Brewing Company, launched in 2018, became one of the fastest-growing craft breweries in the United States by making only non-alcoholic beer. The pattern is shifting, but it is shifting slowly, and it may never complete. The history of alcohol is not really about a drink. It is about what human beings have always wanted from each other: connection, transcendence, relief from the weight of being a conscious creature in a difficult world. Every civilization that has ever existed has found some way to chemically alter its own consciousness. The Sumerians had beer, the Greeks had wine, the Aztecs had pulque, the shamans of Siberia had fermented mare's milk and hallucinogenic mushrooms. There has never been a culture that discovered fermentation and then simply chose not to use it. That consistency tells us something. Not that we are addicted, though addiction is real and devastating and should not be minimized, but that we have always sought, collectively and ritually, some form of experience that ordinary waking consciousness does not provide. The shared cup has always meant something beyond the liquid inside it. It has meant trust, belonging, the willingness to lower one's guard. When archaeologists find ancient brewing vessels, they are finding evidence not just of a drink, but of a gathering. Someone made this for other people to consume together. That impulse to produce something that others would enjoy, to create a shared experience, to sit around something warm and let time slow down, is as old as civilization. And perhaps in a very real sense, it helped create it. The government of the most powerful nation on earth tried to eliminate it for 13 years. The people kept brewing in their basements. Some stories end. This one simply ferments.